Azlan Adnan, M.A. presents The History of Tofu, from a legendary Han Dynasty elixir to one of the world's most versatile foods. Monday, 17th of August, 2026. The food that was supposed to be an elixir. Few foods have traveled as far, changed so little in basic principle, and acquired so many cultural identities as tofu. Today appears almost mundane, a pale block of soybean curd sold in plastic tubs, sliced into soups, stir-fries and curries, grilled over charcoal, fermented into pungent delicacies, blended into desserts or eaten straight from the packet. Yet behind that apparently simple food lies a history stretching across roughly a millennium and a half of documented evidence, and perhaps considerably further if the traditional origin story is correct. Tofu is at once an agricultural technology, a protein concentration technique, a Buddhist food, a staple of East Asian civilization, and, eventually, a global health food. Its story is also a warning about how food history works. The most famous story about tofu may not be historically true. The earliest archaeological evidence is suggestive but not completely decisive. And the person traditionally credited with inventing tofu may have been attached to the food centuries after he supposedly created it. That person was Liu An, Prince of Huainan. The traditional story is irresistible. Liu An, a prince of the Western Han Dynasty, lived from 179 to 122 BC. He was fascinated by Taoist thought and the search for longevity and immortality. According to later Chinese tradition, his court was home to scholars and alchemists who experimented with plants, minerals, and other substances in the hope of discovering the secret of eternal life. Somewhere in this world of experimentation, the story goes, soybeans became part of the experiment. Soybeans were soaked, ground, and turned into a liquid resembling what we now call soy milk. A mineral coagulant, traditionally identified as gypsum, or a salty brine, was added. Instead of producing an elixir of immortality, the liquid separated into white curds. The result was tofu. The alchemists had failed to make humans immortal. They had, supposedly, created something that would outlive dynasties. The story is so elegant that it has become almost inseparable from tofu itself. Modern Chinese accounts continue to associate tofu with Liu An and Huainan in Anhui province. But historians have become much more cautious. The Liu An problem. The first difficulty is chronology. There is no surviving Han Dynasty document that securely says Liu An invented tofu. The earliest known Chinese textual reference to tofu appears much later, in Tao Ku's Qing Yi Lu, written around 965 AD. By then, almost 1,100 years separated the text from Liu An's lifetime. The explicit association between Liu An and tofu became prominent still later, during the Song Dynasty. The celebrated scholar Zhu Xi, who lived from 1130 to 1200, referred to Huainan and tofu in poetry. Later writers reinforced the association, and by the Ming dynasty it had become an established part of Chinese food lore. That does not prove Liu An did not invent tofu. It simply means that historians cannot demonstrate that he did. Modern scholarship has therefore treated the Liu An story as a legend, rather than an established historical fact. One influential recent study argues that tofu may instead have emerged gradually from exchanges between northern pastoral peoples familiar with dairy and cheese-making techniques, and southern Chinese agricultural communities familiar with soybeans. On this interpretation, tofu was not a single flash of invention, but an evolutionary food technology. That explanation is arguably more plausible. Human food history rarely behaves like a laboratory notebook in which an inventor writes down the exact moment of discovery. Fermentation, bread, noodles, cheese, wine, and countless other foods probably emerged through accumulated experimentation, accidents, and incremental improvements. Tofu may have been the same. The archaeological clue from Henan? There is, however, a remarkable archaeological clue. Excavations at a Han period tomb at Dahuting in Henan uncovered stone reliefs depicting food preparation. These images have long attracted attention because some scholars interpreted them as showing stages of tofu production. The imagery appears to include activities associated with grinding beans, heating liquids, and processing food. Chinese historians have regarded the discovery as evidence that tofu production existed in the Eastern Han period. For many years, this was presented as something close to archaeological confirmation of ancient tofu. But even this evidence needs qualification. Researchers have pointed out that the relief does not unambiguously depict the complete tofu making process. In particular, the crucial step of cooking soybean puree is not clearly represented. Experimental attempts to reproduce tofu without properly cooking the soybean mixture do not produce convincing tofu. Consequently, the identification of the relief as a tofu workshop has remained debated. This distinction matters. There is a difference between saying that an ancient image may depict tofu production and saying that archaeologists have definitively discovered a picture of people making tofu. The first is defensible. The second is too strong. The evidence nevertheless points towards an important conclusion. Some form of processed soybean curd was probably known in China long before tofu became the ubiquitous food described in later Chinese literature. Why tofu made sense? Whatever its precise birthplace and date, tofu solved an important nutritional and technological problem. Soybeans are extraordinarily useful plants, but whole soybeans are not particularly convenient food. They are hard, require extensive preparation, and contain compounds that make them difficult to digest when improperly processed. Turning them into a liquid and then coagulating that liquid transforms the bean into something altogether different. The process is deceptively simple. Dried soybeans are soaked in water, ground and cooked. The resulting slurry is filtered to produce soy milk, leaving behind a fibrous residue known as okara. A coagulant is then added to the hot soy milk. Minerals such as calcium sulfate, magnesium chloride or traditional brine-based coagulants cause the soybean proteins to aggregate into curds. Those curds can then be drained and pressed into blocks. In other words, tofu is not simply a soybean that has been cooked. It is a method for extracting, concentrating and restructuring the bean's proteins. This gave farmers an inexpensive and relatively durable source of protein that could be eaten in many forms. The economic significance was considerable. In societies where meat was expensive or unavailable to much of the population, tofu provided a plant-based food that could occupy a similar culinary space. It could be fried, steamed, braised, boiled, fermented, dried or incorporated into soups and sauces. Its neutrality was part of its genius. Tofu does not insist on having a strong flavor of its own. It absorbs the flavors around it. That makes it less like a single dish than a culinary platform. From food technology to everyday food, tofu did not become an important Chinese food merely because someone discovered how to make it. It had to become economically useful, culturally acceptable, and technologically reproducible. By the Song dynasty, tofu was clearly established in Chinese culinary culture. Tao Ku's 10th century account already suggests that it was inexpensive enough to serve as a substitute for meat among ordinary people. By the Song period, tofu had become increasingly associated with everyday eating rather than merely elite experimentation. This was the beginning of tofu's transformation from technology into culture. Chinese cooks discovered that tofu could be treated almost as a blank canvas. In Sichuan cuisine, it became the foundation of mapo tofu, where the mild bean curd absorbs the heat of chili and the aroma of fermented bean paste and Sichuan pepper. Elsewhere, tofu was smoked, dried, fermented, or transformed into sheets and other products. Duhua, the soft, barely set form of soybean curd, developed its own enormous culinary tradition. Depending upon region, it could be served savory or sweet. And then there were the deliberately fermented varieties whose aromas can challenge anyone unfamiliar with them. Tofu had ceased to be merely tofu. It had become a family of foods. Buddhism and the Great East Asian migration of tofu. One of the most important forces in tofu's expansion was Buddhism. Buddhist dietary practices, especially among monastic communities, encouraged the development of alternatives to meat. It would be misleading to say that all Buddhists everywhere were strictly vegetarian, because Buddhist dietary rules varied considerably across time and place. But in East Asia, vegetarian traditions became particularly important within many Buddhist communities. Tofu fitted the requirement remarkably well. It supplied protein without requiring an animal to be killed, and it could be incorporated into an elaborate cuisine rather than treated merely as a substitute for meat. Buddhist temples consequently became important centers of vegetarian cookery. This is one reason tofu's history cannot be separated entirely from the history of Buddhism in East Asia. The food traveled along the same cultural networks as monks, scriptures, cooking techniques, and religious institutions. Tofu reaches Korea. Tofu eventually became an important part of Korean cuisine, where it is known as dubu. The exact date and route of its arrival remain uncertain. Korean historical scholarship generally places its transmission in the late Goryeo period, probably through China's political and cultural connections with Korea. By the Joseon period, tofu was deeply embedded in Korean society. Its importance was not merely culinary. Korean records show tofu being produced for royal and state purposes. Certain Buddhist temples were designated to manufacture tofu for royal rituals and official functions. Professional tofu makers also emerged, while households produced tofu for everyday consumption. There is even evidence that Chinese imperial courts admired Korean tofu-making skills. A Korean woman was reportedly praised during the Ming period for her ability to make tofu and other foods particularly well. The Chinese court's appreciation of Korean tofu illustrates an important point. Once tofu traveled, it was no longer simply a Chinese food. Different societies began developing their own techniques and preferences. The journey to Japan. Japan's relationship with tofu is particularly important because Japanese cooks transformed it into one of the central ingredients of their culinary tradition. The traditional account attributes its arrival to Buddhist monks and the movement of knowledge between China and Japan. Jianzhen, the Chinese Buddhist monk better known in Japan as Ganjin, arrived in Japan in 754 after years of extraordinarily difficult attempts to make the journey. He was already an elderly man and had lost his sight during the earlier voyages. It is tempting to identify him personally as the man who brought tofu to Japan. The evidence, however, does not justify such certainty. The broader transmission of Chinese Buddhist food culture to Japan is well established, but the precise identity of the person who first introduced tofu is not. The earliest secure Japanese documentary evidence comes much later. In 1183, a diary associated with Kasuga Shrine in Nara records tofu as an offering. Japanese sources therefore provide firm evidence that tofu was present by the late 12th century. Initially, tofu was closely associated with temples, religious life, and the cuisine of elites. Over time, however, it escaped the monastery. The Japanese Tofu Revolution. Japan did something remarkable with tofu. It turned a basic Chinese food into a sophisticated culinary category. Different textures emerged. Firm momen tofu was pressed through cloth, while delicate kinagoshi tofu was allowed to retain a softer, silkier texture. Fried tofu became abura-age. Deep-fried tofu pouches became essential ingredients in dishes such as kitsune udon. Tofu could be grilled, simmered, steamed, chilled, fermented, or incorporated into sweets and desserts. By the Edo period, tofu had become a cultural obsession. In 1782, a cookbook called Tofu Hyakuchin, literally 100 tofu delicacies, appeared in Japan. It offered 100 different preparations and became an extraordinary success. 2 follow-up volumes followed, expanding the repertoire still further. This was more than the publication of a cookbook. It was evidence of a mature food culture. Tofu had moved from being a specialized ingredient to being something ordinary households could discuss, compare, experiment with, and enjoy. The cookbook effectively demonstrated that one humble ingredient could support an enormous culinary vocabulary. Tofu in the Chinese imagination. In China, tofu acquired meanings beyond nutrition. It became associated with simplicity, frugality, humility, and endurance. It could be the food of peasants and emperors alike. That social range was one of its great strengths. A poor farmer could eat tofu because it was cheap. A Buddhist monk could eat it because it fitted a vegetarian diet. A scholar could appreciate it as an elegant food. An emperor could have it served at court. Tofu therefore crossed one of the most important boundaries in traditional society, the boundary between necessity and refinement. Few foods have done that so successfully. The first European witnesses. Tofu remained almost completely unknown in Europe for centuries. Then, during the 17th century, European missionaries and travelers began describing Chinese food in greater detail. One of the most important was the Spanish Dominican friar Domingo Fernández de Navarrete, who spent years in China. His writings described tofu as a widely consumed food made from beans, comparing its production to cheese-making. His account became an important source for later European curiosity about soybean foods. By the 18th century, tofu had acquired a reputation in Europe as a strange Chinese form of vegetable cheese. The comparison with cheese was not entirely unreasonable. Both processes involve transforming a liquid into a solid by means of coagulation. But tofu and dairy cheese represent two very different biological and technological systems. Cheese concentrates milk proteins and fat. Tofu concentrates soybean proteins. The resemblance is therefore functional rather than biological. Benjamin Franklin meets tofu. One of the strangest episodes in tofu's Western history involves Benjamin Franklin. In January 1770, Franklin was in London when he became interested in descriptions of a Chinese food made from soybeans. He corresponded with James Flint, who had spent many years in China and knew something about Chinese food practices. Flint described how the Chinese converted soybeans into what he called tofu. Franklin subsequently wrote to his friend John Bartram in Philadelphia, sending soybean seeds and information about the mysterious Chinese food. He described it as a kind of cheese made from Chinese beans. Franklin therefore occupies an unusual place in tofu history. He was not a tofu maker. He did not introduce tofu as a commercial food to America. But he was among the first Americans to take a serious intellectual interest in it. His curiosity was characteristic of the 18th century Enlightenment. Investigate something unfamiliar, obtain a specimen, correspond with another knowledgeable person, and see whether the knowledge can be reproduced. The experiment did not launch a tofu revolution. America would have to wait almost 2 centuries. Tofu crosses the Pacific. Chinese migrants eventually brought tofu-making traditions directly to North America. During the 19th century, Chinese communities expanded rapidly in the United States, particularly during the California Gold Rush and the construction of the transcontinental railways. Tofu became part of the food economy of Chinatowns and Chinese communities. But outside those communities, it remained largely invisible. This is an important distinction. Tofu had technically arrived in America centuries before the modern health food movement, but it had not yet become an American food. The difference between presence and adoption is crucial in food history. A food can exist in a country for generations without becoming part of the mainstream diet. That is precisely what happened to tofu. America grew soybeans before it learned to eat them. There is an irony at the heart of American soybean history. The United States eventually became one of the world's great soybean-producing countries. But for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Americans did not regard soybeans primarily as a food for humans. Soybeans became increasingly important as sources of oil and animal feed. Industrial agriculture discovered that the humble bean had enormous commercial potential. American industrialists also experimented with soybean products. Henry Ford famously investigated soybean materials for industrial applications, including plastics and other manufactured products. Yet tofu remained marginal. The soybean had become an American commodity long before tofu became an American food. The vegetarian revolution, the transformation finally came in the 20th century. Several forces converged. Vegetarianism expanded in Western countries. Interest in Asian philosophy increased. The environmental movement questioned industrial livestock production. Nutrition researchers began paying greater attention to plant proteins, and a generation of consumers became interested in foods that appeared simultaneously exotic, wholesome, and practical. Tofu was waiting for them. The breakthrough came particularly strongly in the 1970s. Shurtleff and Aoyagi, two people played an unusually important role in introducing tofu to Western consumers: William Shurtleff and Akiko Aoyagi. Shurtleff had become interested in Zen Buddhism and soy foods. Aoyagi, his Japanese collaborator, brought practical knowledge of Japanese cuisine and food preparation. Beginning in the early 1970s, they traveled extensively in Japan, visiting tofu makers, restaurants, households, and other sources of traditional knowledge. Their objective was not merely to write a vegetarian cookbook. They wanted to understand tofu as a food system. In 1975, they published the Book of Tofu, Food for Mankind. The book combined history, nutrition, recipes, manufacturing information, and instructions for making tofu at home and commercially. The timing was almost perfect. The Western counterculture was discovering vegetarianism, natural foods, and Asian traditions at the same time that modern food manufacturing was making tofu easier to produce, package, and distribute. Shurtleff and Aoyagi helped translate an East Asian food tradition into a form Western consumers could understand. The tofu revolution had begun. From hippie food to supermarket staple, Tofu initially acquired a somewhat unfortunate reputation in America. It was associated with health food shops, communes, vegetarians, and the counterculture. For some consumers, this made tofu attractive. For others, it made tofu seem austere, strange, or joyless. The food itself did not change. The cultural meaning changed. Restaurants began experimenting with tofu. Supermarkets started stocking refrigerated blocks. Vegetarian cookbooks multiplied. Asian cuisines became increasingly familiar. Tofu eventually escaped the health food shop and entered ordinary supermarkets. Today it can be found almost everywhere in the developed world. It appears in vegan restaurants, Chinese restaurants, Japanese restaurants, Korean restaurants, fusion cuisine, and mainstream home cooking. The former Chinese cheese has become a global ingredient. Tofu's secret is its neutrality. There is a deeper reason tofu survived so successfully. It is extraordinarily adaptable. Tofu can be soft or firm, fresh or fermented, plain or flavored, raw or cooked, fried or steamed. It can be the star of a dish or almost disappear into one. A block of firm tofu can be browned until crisp. Silken tofu can become a creamy dessert. Fermented tofu can acquire an intense savory character. Tofu can absorb chili, soy sauce, sesame, ginger, garlic, miso, mushrooms, curry spices, or almost anything else a cook chooses to give it. Its neutrality is therefore not a weakness. It is a form of culinary intelligence. Tofu does not compete with the cook. It collaborates. The technology behind the food, the basic principle, has changed remarkably little over the centuries. The soybean is transformed into a liquid. The liquid is separated from the insoluble fiber. The proteins are coagulated. The curds are separated from the whey. The resulting mass is shaped according to the desired texture. What has changed is the precision. Modern manufacturers can control temperature, particle size, protein concentration, coagulant concentration, pressing pressure, moisture content, texture, and microbial safety with extraordinary consistency. The industrial tofu factory is therefore an extension of an ancient kitchen technique. The machinery may be stainless steel rather than wood and stone, but the fundamental chemistry remains recognizable. This is one reason tofu is such a fascinating food historically. It is ancient biotechnology that has survived industrialization, a food of empire without being an imperial food. Tofu also demonstrates how food travels without following the boundaries of political power. It survived the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties. It moved through Buddhist networks. It crossed into Korea and Japan. It traveled with migrants. It was described by European missionaries. It attracted the curiosity of Benjamin Franklin. It entered Chinese American communities. It survived decades of marginalization in the West. Then, almost unexpectedly, it became a global food. The empire metaphor is therefore slightly misleading. Tofu did not conquer the world through armies, merchants, or governments. It traveled through kitchens. That may be a more powerful form of cultural transmission. The accidental food that fed an empire. The traditional story says that Luan's alchemists wanted immortality and accidentally produced tofu. Whether that story is literally true is impossible to establish. But its symbolism is difficult to resist. They were supposedly looking for something extraordinary. They found something ordinary. And the ordinary thing proved more valuable. Tofu did not make anyone immortal. But it became a cheap source of protein, a staple of peasant diets, a valued Buddhist food, a component of royal cuisine, a pillar of Japanese vegetarian cookery, an important Korean ingredient, and eventually a global plant-based food. The search for immortality produced, at least according to legend, something more useful: nourishment. What the history of tofu really teaches us. The history of tofu is not simply the history of a food. It is the history of how human beings turn agricultural raw materials into something more useful. The soybean itself is remarkable. But tofu represents a second layer of ingenuity. Someone had to discover that the bean could be soaked and ground. Someone had to learn that the resulting liquid could be cooked. Someone had to discover that minerals or salts could cause the proteins to coagulate. Someone had to learn how to separate, drain, and press the curds. And generations of cooks then had to discover what could be done with the resulting substance. That process may have taken place gradually over centuries. This is why the question, who invented tofu, may ultimately be less interesting than another question: how did people learn to make it? The answer probably involves experimentation, observation, migration, exchange, and countless small improvements made by people whose names history never recorded. Liu An, if he had anything to do with tofu, may have been only one participant in a much larger process. From bean to civilization, there is something almost philosophical about tofu. The soybean begins as a hard, dry seed. Water softens it. Grinding breaks it down. Heat transforms it. Coagulation reorganizes it. Pressure gives it form. The result is no longer recognizable as the original bean, yet almost everything important about the bean remains within it. That is precisely what civilization does to raw materials. It transforms without necessarily destroying. The history of tofu is therefore a story about transformation, of beans into curds, food into culture, necessity into cuisine, and local knowledge into global practice. Its journey from East Asian kitchens to supermarkets around the world took centuries. Its basic chemistry survived almost unchanged. Its meaning changed repeatedly. And that may be the real reason tofu has endured. It is humble enough to belong to everyone, adaptable enough to belong almost anywhere, and ancient enough to remind us that some of the most consequential technologies in human history began not in laboratories or factories, but beside a cooking fire. The legendary alchemists of Huainan may have failed to discover the secret of eternal life. But if their accidental invention really was tofu, they discovered something almost as remarkable. They discovered a food that refused to die. A brief chronology: 179 BC, Liu An, later associated by tradition with the invention of tofu, is born. 2nd century BC, traditional accounts place the invention of tofu in Huainan during the Western Han period, although the claim cannot be historically verified. 2nd century AD, Han period archaeological material from Henan is later interpreted by some scholars as evidence of tofu production, although the interpretation remains disputed. 965 AD, Taoku's Qing Yilu provides the earliest widely cited written reference to tofu, indicating that it was already an established and inexpensive food. Song Dynasty, 9601-279, tofu becomes increasingly prominent in Chinese culinary culture and among ordinary consumers. 1183. The earliest secure Japanese documentary reference records tofu being used as an offering at Kasuga Shrine in Nara. Late Goryeo period, tofu is believed to have reached Korea by this period, where it developed into the important culinary category known as dubu. 1603 to 1868. During Japan's Edo period, tofu becomes increasingly integrated into everyday cuisine. 1782, Tofu Hyakuchin, 100 Tofu Delicacies, is published in Japan and becomes a major culinary success. 1665 to 1676. Domingo Fernández de Navarrete describes tofu in his accounts of China, helping introduce the food to European readers. 1770, Benjamin Franklin discusses tofu in correspondence with John Bartram and sends soybean seeds and information about its manufacture. 19th century, Chinese migrants established tofu-making traditions in North America. Early 20th century, soybeans become increasingly important commercially in the United States, although tofu remains a niche food. 1975, William Shurtleff and Akiko Aoyagi published the Book of Tofu, helping introduce tofu-making history and recipes to a Western audience. Late 20th century, tofu moves from Asian communities and specialist health food shops into mainstream Western supermarkets. 21st century, tofu becomes a globally recognized food and a major ingredient in vegetarian and vegan cuisines. The final irony: tofu's greatest achievement may be that it no longer needs an explanation. A Chinese emperor could eat it. A Buddhist monk could depend upon it. A Korean royal kitchen could refine it. A Japanese householder could consult an entire cookbook devoted to it. A Chinese immigrant could make it thousands of kilometers from home. A 19th century American could grow the bean without understanding its culinary potential. A 20th century vegetarian could rediscover it. And a 21st century consumer can buy it almost anywhere. That is an extraordinary journey for a food whose entire identity can be reduced to three things: soybean, water, and a coagulant. Whether Liu An really invented tofu will probably remain uncertain. What is certain is that human beings learned to turn the humble soybean into one of the most adaptable foods ever devised. And perhaps that is a better story than the legend. Not one immortal prince inventing tofu in a single moment, but generations of anonymous cooks, farmers, monks, artisans, and migrants gradually perfecting a technology until the world could no longer imagine its cuisines without it. Tofu did not conquer civilization. It quietly became part of it.
The author has placed this work in the public domain. It may be freely imported, exported, shared, distributed, edited, modified, or reformatted without explicit consent from the author. As a visually impaired person, the author asserts his rights under the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. 2013, wipo.int.
Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.